Dakota, Freeman, and Miller. They get into an intense debate regarding the subject matter of this artist's masterpiece as they give two separate opinions helping to build this legendary legacy. We'll be right back after this word from one of our sponsors.
Welcome to The Debate. What if I told you the most authentic, emotionally raw indie rock track of the year, a song entirely about spiritual burnout, was mathematically engineered by a classical choral director and distributed by a machine learning algorithm?
I'd say that sounds like a massive contradiction just waiting to collapse on itself.
Right. But that is exactly the strange, fascinating landscape we're looking at today. We're exploring the intersection of technology, classical pedigree, and raw authenticity in the modern music industry.
Specifically, we're looking at this through the lens of a recent profile on independent artist Austin Perkins, focusing on his breakout track, Burning Heart, and, his discovery by Discovery Radio, plus his upcoming 11 to 12 song album slated for 2026.
Exactly. And I believe that in our digital age, an artist's ability to evolve alongside technology and utilize formal structural polish is absolutely essential to effectively distribute their message.
Well, and I believe that Austin Perkins actually proves the exact opposite. He proves that an uncompromising commitment to raw, purely human-made art, complete with its glaring flaws, is the only authentic way to preserve the soul and emotion of music in an increasingly artificial world.
Let me lay out exactly why I see Perkins' trajectory as a triumph of structure and evolution. While raw emotion is undeniably vital to any artistic endeavor, the modern industry demands more than just feeling. It demands execution.
Sure, execution matters.
Right, and it is incredibly ironic, and brilliantly so, that Perkins' success is fueled on one side by algorithmic technological distribution through TikTok, and on the other side, by an elite classical pedigree. I mean, he holds a master's in music education from the University of Mobile.
He does, yeah.
He toured nationally with the Voices of Mobile, utilizing modern digital tools and highly formal academic structures doesn't dilute his art. It acts as a necessary, highly calibrated amplifier for his core message of spiritual renewal.
See, I think the true driver of Perkins' resonance isn't his academic pedigree or the algorithms that happen to host his files on a server. It is his radical vulnerability and his explicit outright rejection of artificiality.
But the tools...
Let me finish. Perkins takes a hardline stance against artificial intelligence and insists on purely human-made art because platforms and pedigrees are entirely secondary. What actually connects with the listener in tracks like Burning Heart is the unfiltered human grief. Yes, but...
It's the struggle. It's the imperfections in a spoken word confession. If you over-prioritize the polish and the technology, you actively strip away the very humanity that makes the music worth listening to in the first place.
If you're listening to this and wondering how a classically trained choral director ends up creating an emotionally volatile indie rock anthem, you're not alone. At first glance, the two worlds just don't make sense together. But let's look closely at the mechanics of how that raw feeling is actually achieved.
Okay, let's look at it. My position is that this classical pedigree is precisely what elevates his rock instrumentation. Think of it like a master architect building a deliberately rustic cabin. The cabin feels raw, it feels natural, it feels spontaneous. But that aesthetic is only possible because it is supported by an elite, highly educated structural integrity beneath the floorboards.
I'll give you the architect analogy, but here's where it falls apart for me. It assumes that rock music is supposed to be structurally perfect beneath the surface. I question whether rock music loses its essential nature when it is overly structured by someone whose professional title is literally choral director.
I don't see why it would.
Because rock, historically, is born from rebellion. It is fundamentally about unresolved tension, and the stated goal of Burning Heart is to be a battle cry against apathy.
Right, but the battle cry doesn't work if the listener can't decipher the sonic information. When you have heavy, distorted electric guitars, they eat up the entire mid-range of the frequency spectrum.
That's just the genre, though.
Yeah, but if an untrained vocalist just screams over that, it turns into auditory mud. Someone with a master's in music education understands the rigorous mathematics of vocal arrangement. Perkins knows exactly how to voice his background vocals in the extreme highs and the sub-lows.
Creating a pocket, yeah.
Exactly. He creates a perfectly carved-out pocket in the mix for that spoken word confession to sit. The rich, layered choral arrangements he employs are what actually make the rock elements hit with such force.
But at what cost? When you apply a choral director's approach, which is fundamentally about resolving dissonance into perfect harmony, like the classic Vita-I cadence, you risk something. You risk inadvertently sanitizing the visceral, bleeding reality of that battle cry.
Sanitizing it? I completely disagree.
The danger of a master's degree in music education is that it teaches you the correct way to resolve a chord. But human grief and spiritual lukewarmness don't resolve correctly. They are messy, they linger.
I don't think he's sanitizing the grief at all. He's just giving it a structural foundation so it doesn't just dissipate into noise. Which naturally forces us to look at how this highly structured yet emotionally raw music is categorized. Because stripping away the standard sounds of a genre creates a massive problem for an artist.
It does, especially in his space.
Right. Perkins is on a mission to create Christian music that doesn't sound like Christian music. He is actively bypassing the overly polished, perpetually happy worship tracks to focus on real hardship. I mean, Burning Heart opens with a raw confession of losing faith.
It does.
By shedding the traditional sonic tropes of Christian music, the soaring, predictable synth pads and the neatly packaged lyrical resolutions, he bypasses the prejudices of listeners.
You're giving him way too much credit for shedding those tropes. Have you considered the inherent contradiction in that strategy?
How is it a contradiction to reach people where they are?
Because you are praising him for abandoning the sound of his own genre to reach a new audience. But let's look at the actual lyrics of Burning Heart. The bridge builds to this immense emotional resonance where he says, "I'm returning to a burning heart, back to the way that it was at the start."
Yeah, it's a powerful moment.
And crucially, he says no more compromise. He is declaring an absolute end to halfway commitments. So I have to ask, if the entire message of your music is about an uncompromising faith, is masking the genre itself a form of compromise?
Not at all. Changing a delivery mechanism isn't the same as compromising the core truth. Let's talk about cultural signifiers in audio production. Traditional Christian music has become a sonic gated community.
A gated community?
Yes. It uses specific auditory cues, like pristine vocal processing, bright acoustic guitars, to signal safety to its core demographic. Perkins isn't masking his message, he's leaving the gated community. I would argue that a spoken word confession over distorted indie rock instrumentation is a vastly more accurate sonic representation of actual human grief than a polished four-chord worship song.
But genre isn't just a delivery mechanism. It is an identity. When an artist actively tries to avoid sounding like the community they are speaking to, they risk alienating their core audience. And they do it just to chase a demographic that might only engage with the aesthetic, not the theology.
I think listeners are smarter than that.
He is singing about repentance and returning to a centered spiritual life. If you dress that up in the clothing of secular indie rock specifically to trick the ear of a disillusioned listener, you are engaging in a marketing tactic. And marketing tactics are by definition a compromise of raw expression in favor of calculated reception.
But stripping away that traditional packaging means traditional Christian radio won't play his music. The gatekeepers at the local stations aren't going to spin a spoken word indie rock confession.
Well, no, of course not.
So where does an uncategorized artist actually go to get heard? They are forced onto meritocratic platforms. And this is exactly how Discover You Radio found Perkins while they were talent scouting on TikTok. This proves that the platform is an unparalleled testing ground.
Oh, come on.
I'm serious. I champion platforms like TikTok for literally saving the music industry. It completely democratizes discovery. The old record executives in boardrooms deciding what fits a radio format are gone. Instead, scouts can find these needles in haystacks based entirely on merit and direct audience connection.
I have to stop you there because calling TikTok a pure meritocracy fundamentally misunderstands how algorithms function. It doesn't democratize discovery. It just shifts the gatekeeping from human record executives to machine learning algorithms. And those algorithms are optimized strictly for one thing, and that is user retention.
But retention means people like the music.
No. Retention means the app hacked your attention span. It makes the entire music industry dangerously dependent on viral moments rather than lasting artistry. Think about the mechanics of how songs are written now because of TikTok.
It's just a different format.
It's destructive. Artists are actively pressured to structurally alter their music, forcing a massive, catchy hook into the first 3 seconds of a track just to stop someone from scrolling. That completely destroys the concept of a slow build, of setting a theme, or of building emotional tension.
But Perkins didn't do that. Burning Heart is a slow burn. It literally opens with spoken word. He proved that you can succeed on the platform without compromising the structure of the art.
Exactly. He succeeded in spite of the algorithm, not because the algorithm is a healthy meritocracy. Look at the lyrics again. No more sleepy eyes, and crucially, no more praising man. He is explicitly rejecting the validation of the crowd.
Right, but his slow build confession is the exact opposite of an algorithm-chasing dopamine hit. The fact that Discover You Radio found him on TikTok doesn't validate TikTok. It validates Perkins' immense, undeniable talent. His raw vulnerability stood out precisely because it was surrounded by a sea of artificial, calculated content. Relying on a viral casino to sustain a career built on deep, slow-burn spiritual renewal is an incredibly precarious foundation.
It may be precarious, but it is the reality of the modern distribution landscape. The tool exists, and ignoring it means silencing your own message, which forces us to confront a much more uncomfortable question.
Let's hear it.
If we accept that algorithms are the only viable way to distribute this uncategorized music at scale, should algorithms dictate the creation of the music? Perkins is currently tracking his 2026 album, and he has made a highly vocal, absolute refusal on social media to use artificial intelligence in his production.
As well he should.
He insists strictly on human flaws and human soul. Now, as someone who champions his classical training and his use of modern distribution, I have to push back hard on this. Outright refusing AI in a digital age is exactly like a 20th century musician refusing to use a synthesizer or a drum machine or even a multi-track recording console.
A synthesizer doesn't write the melody for you. It doesn't generate the emotion out of thin air.
Neither does AI if it's used by a master craftsman. Let's break down the mechanics of what AI actually is in an audio production context. It is a complex algorithm for manipulating sound waves. It's a tool.
It's more than just a tool.
No, think about it. If Perkins needs a massive echoing choir for the bridge of a new song, why should he spend 60 hours manually tracking 50 different vocal stems? He could use an AI chorus plugin to instantly generate that choral texture and then explicitly guide, curate, and layer that texture to express his own spiritual journey.
Because that defeats the entire purpose of his art.
It frees up his creative energy for the actual songwriting. It doesn't inherently erase the artist's soul if the human is still the author. Refusing it entirely feels like a performative rejection of progress.
I couldn't disagree more strongly, and I will defend Perkins' stance to the absolute limit here. You keep calling it a tool, comparing it to a synthesizer. But a synthesizer is an instrument that responds directly to the physical touch, the velocity, and the mathematical input of the human playing it.
And an AI prompt responds to human input.
Generative AI is not an instrument, it is an aggregator. It scrapes the average of human emotion from a database of pre-existing art and simply mimics it. And when we are talking about a song like Burning Heart, the stakes are entirely different. AI might be able to mathematically mimic the acoustic properties of a burning heart, but a machine has never experienced spiritual lukewarmness. A machine has never felt grief. A machine cannot repent.
But let's be incredibly practical for a second. Does the listener's ear actually care? If an AI-modulated reverb tail perfectly simulates the acoustic emptiness of a cathedral, and that sound makes a teenager in their bedroom cry and reconnect with their faith, hasn't the tool achieved its spiritual goal regardless of its binary origins?
The listener's subconscious absolutely knows the difference. And even if they couldn't articulate why, the integrity of the art demands the human element. You are viewing music production as a mechanical hurdle to be cleared as efficiently as possible so the product can be distributed. Perkins views the labor as the liturgy.
The labor as the liturgy? Explain what you mean by that.
Think about the historical context of religious art. Monks spending years physically illuminating manuscripts by hand. The physical effort wasn't just a means to an end. The sacrifice of time and physical energy imbued the final product with spiritual weight.
Okay, I see where you're going.
It's the difference between buying a mass-produced machine-cut table and a table hand-carved by a carpenter. They both hold your dinner perfectly well, but one contains the time, the sweat, and the humanity of its maker. When Perkins chooses to physically breathe into a microphone 50 times to stack a choir rather than clicking a button, that temporal commitment gives the music its soul.
That is a very romantic way to look at studio time.
It's the truth. When his voice wavers during that spoken word confession, that microtonal imperfection is the literal sound of a human soul wrestling with its own frailty. AI seeks to eliminate frailty. Perkins believes that human-made art is the only way to establish the genuine emotional intimacy that listeners are desperately craving in this increasingly automated industry.
I completely understand the romance in that perspective. But look at the broader implications for an independent artist making an 11 to 12 song album for 2026. If he relies entirely on manual labor for every aspect of production, he is drastically limiting his output.
Maybe output isn't the most important thing.
In a landscape where platforms demand constant engagement just to keep your head above water, an artist's ability to utilize technological shortcuts allows them to survive. The soul isn't in the manual labor of hitting the record button and tracking a backing vocal for the 20th time. The soul is in the initial creative spark. The tools just get that spark out to the world faster.
And I maintain that when shortcuts are easily accessible, choosing the hard work of writing, tracking, and producing real music is in itself an act of rebellion. It proves to the listener that the grief is real, the struggle is real, and the renewal is real. If the process is artificial, the empathy it generates is built on a lie.
Well, that brings us to the core tension we've been dancing around this entire discussion. We've navigated through the architecture of Austin Perkins' music, from the complex vocal arrangements born of his classical roots at the University of Mobile, to his breakout success bypassing traditional gatekeepers with Discover You Radio on TikTok.
Right.
My position remains that structure, elite classical training, technological adoption, and modern platforms are the necessary vessels. They are the calculated engineering that allows profound, raw messages like Burning Heart to be heard at scale. The polish and the tools do not erase the humanity. They amplify it, acting as a megaphone to reach the disillusioned listener exactly where they are.
And my conclusion remains that artificial distribution and automated production methods pale in comparison to the essential ingredient of great music. Perkins' resonance isn't a victory of algorithms or academic engineering. It is a testament to an uncompromising, flawed human soul refusing to take shortcuts.
Even if it makes the process harder.
Exactly. The raw vulnerability, the explicit rejection of pleasing the masses with conventional Christian music tropes, and the insistence on human-made art are what actually save the music. Without that beating human heart at the center, the most perfectly engineered song is just empty noise.
It is clear that we share a deep appreciation for Perkins as a fascinating case study. He truly sits at the exact intersection where classical roots meet modern indie rock and where deep spiritual theology meets the digital age. We obviously have continued disagreement on whether rejecting technological evolution, specifically regarding AI in his 2026 album, is a sustainable long-term strategy for an independent artist.
We do. And I think that unresolved tension, much like the music itself, is exactly what makes his upcoming work so highly anticipated.
Absolutely. It leaves us with a compelling question about the nature of creation itself. Do the tools an artist uses fundamentally change the soul they pour into the work? We encourage all of you to explore Burning Heart for yourselves, listen to the nuances of the production we've discussed today, and keep an eye out for Perkins' full-length album in 2026.
Definitely worth a listen.
See exactly how this balance between human frailty and structural polish plays out in the music itself. Are we looking at a master architect mathematically constructing a beautiful illusion using modern tools, or are we simply witnessing a raw, unfiltered human heart catching fire? That is something you will have to decide for yourself.
Thank you for listening to Discover You Radio's discussions. We'd like to invite you to research the artist who was spotlighted on this episode and add them to your playlist. If they have a website, join their mailing list. You never know. They just may become the next legendary legacy through Discover You Radio. Because listeners like you made it possible. Thank you for your support.